Hi everyone, my name is Sofia Avila, and today I will be talking about music, murder, and machismo, and using these as a lens to reanalyze gender violence in Mexico. I will start with a trigger warning. I will be talking about sexual assault and gender violence, and these are very heavy topics, so if you feel you must leave the room at any point, please feel free to do so. This is Lorena Gutierrez. She was the mother of Fatima, who was born in 2002 and was the oldest sister in a family of 3. The family lived in a rural community in Guadalajara, and Fatima was a motivated student who always insisted on going to school despite it being far away. She would walk to and from school every day, and her mom always expected her at 3 p.m. with a warm meal. But in February of 2015, when Fatima was just 12 years old, she never got home. When Fatima was walking back from school, she was taken by 3 young men who had been her neighbors since she was 2. When she didn't get home, her parents went out to frantically look for her, finding her body a few meters away, abandoned in a forest. According to a forensic study, the 3 young men beat Fatima until all of her teeth fell out. They pulled one of her eyes out of its socket. They broke her wrists, legs, raped her, and finally dropped a 130-pound rock on her head, successfully killing her. The young men had no motive, and the experts involved in the case believe they killed Fatima just on the basis of her being a woman, especially because one of them already had a history of gender violence. This is known as femicide, or the killing of a woman or a girl, in particular by a man and on account of her gender. And Fatima and her family are just one in the thousands affected by this problem in Mexico every year. In fact, in just the first 6 months of 2018, there were 500 femicides. Gender violence also takes the form of sexual assault. With 120,000 women being raped in Mexico each year, Mexico holds the #1 place for sexual violence in the world. And a woman is raped every 4 minutes. That means that by the time I finish giving this presentation, 2 more women will have been raped in my home country. So I asked myself, why Mexico? What is causing these alarming rates of violence? The research, both national and international, all point to a common factor: machismo. Definitions of machismo vary, but it can be generally described as an exaggerated pride in masculinity. It's a form of sexism, but at the core of it is not that men have to be better than women, it's that they have to be machos, and thus the strongest and most powerful person in the room. My gender studies teacher said it best. The sexist man might harm a woman because he feels he can. The macho man will do it because he feels he must. And this is a mindset that gets passed down generation to generation, usually in small ways. When I interviewed my brother, he told me his first memory of machismo was from when he was 6. My dad took him to the soccer stadium and taught him all of these curse words to scream at the referee. He told my brother that the most important one was puto, a derogatory term used to describe a homosexual man. My brother recalled being uncomfortable with the insult, but feeling like he had to say it so as not to disappoint my dad. This was a young boy who felt he needed to verbally attack a stranger because he wanted his father's approval. And the insult everyone agreed was most offensive was gay, because there's nothing more unmanly than being physically attracted to a man, and nothing is worse than being unmanly. This kind of machista attitude permeates Mexican culture, and it was the #1 reason why I chose to leave the country. I knew if I stayed, I would be expected to be a subordinate to men, because macho pride is threatened by powerful women, and this is reflected by the leadership statistics in the country. Women make up less than 4% in all the board of directors of all major Mexican companies, and only 10% of Congress, which probably explains why our criminal laws are failing to address gender violence. In most of the US and Europe, gender-based crime is considered a form of hate crime, and thus carries a stronger sentence. But in Mexico, only 13 out of 31 states have criminalized gender violence, meaning a lot of men are released from prison in under 10 years. Now, in my research, I found that there were countless factors that could have originated machismo. Some say it was genetics, others blame the presence of the Catholic Church in the country, or the arrival of the Spaniards in the Spanish conquest. But today, I want to talk about a factor that most researchers have failed to acknowledge, and that's media. More specifically, Latino music. To do this, I will first provide some context for the relevance of my question. I'll then talk about some of the base research I did, explain the history of music in the country, address the psychological impact of music, and then finally discuss some of the implications. I was interested in the connection between music and gender violence because I've always loved the rhythms, but I hated the lyrical content. I'm in love with 4 babies. They always give me what I want. They fuck whenever I tell them to. None of them put up a fight. Would you mind if I disrespect you and then blame it on the alcohol? Turn off the lights and take off your clothes because I honestly don't want to see you naked. You're kind of fat, but you're great at blowing. I wanted to understand what impact these lyrics could be having on what is already a deeply machista country. And I thought the question was particularly relevant given the rising popularity of the genre, which according to Spotify has seen a 119% growth since 2014. So I started with a simple survey. I wanted to get an idea of how many people were listening to reggaeton and how they felt it might be having an impact in Mexican society. I got 70 responses, mostly from acquaintances, so this sample is in no way representative of the country as a whole, but it does provide some insightful clues. Of the people I surveyed, a staggering 95.7% said they listened to reggaeton at least once per week. But the majority perceived that this was having little to no impact on Mexican culture. Their thoughts were, yes, the music is sexist, but the country is sexist independently of it. They were saying, in other words, the music simply reflects culture. Because of how ubiquitous machismo is, I had this assumption that it had always been around. So to confirm or deny this, I went back to some of our earliest records, which are those of the Aztec civilization, the last one that gave way to Mexico as we know it today. And what I found surprised me. According to anthropologists, Aztec men and women were thought to be different, but of equal importance. Records of the time show that women were heavily involved in business and were active members of the community. Even after the fall of the empire, it is theorized that they made up half of the workforce. So when does machismo come in? According to Google Ngrams, the word machismo doesn't start being used until 1910, at the start of the revolution, when it started being used in songs. Mexicans started coming up with songs that were patriotic and inspired action for the revolution. For example, I am a true blue Mexican and I have an obligation to be a land where I was born, to be a macho among machos, and that's why I proudly sing to my country. The macho ideal was created to inspire action and actively defend the country, and at this point, this energy was being directed towards a productive cause. But by 1920, the revolution ends and the macho archetype does not. The songs continued to have virtually the same content, except there was no common target anymore. The macho had to be a macho before all of society. I am your king and my horse is second only to me. Now you will bow to my law or I'll send you from this world. Las Inditas is a particularly telling song of this phenomenon. It will be a pretty sight to see all these gringo corpses. In truth, I hope they will bring their gringo women along because we're getting tired of loving our Indian girls. The song was written in 1940, at the start of World War II, but the song is no longer about the war at all. In fact, it's about Americans, and Mexico was an ally of the US at the start of the war. So it's clear that the songwriter did not even care about targeting the correct person anymore. It wasn't about the battles, it wasn't about inspiring action. It was just about providing the machista message. And as these songs became more and more popular, women's participation in society began to dwindle. Of course, correlation does not mean causation, but it is true that without these lyrics, the concept of machismo itself might not even have existed. So yes, music reflects culture, but I think in some ways, music also creates it. And the way that music does this has been a topic of interest for researchers for years. In a study conducted by Craig A. Anderson and Nicholas Carnegie, it consisted of 5 different experiments, each controlling for different variables, in which a control group was exposed to neutral lyrics and an experimental group listened to music with violent content. This latter group scored significantly higher in a subsequent state hostility scale test. A study by Christy Berringen and Gordon Nagayama showed similar results for misogynist rap music. But even just basic human logic allows us to infer that the more we listen to something, the more normal it starts to become, and the more we start to believe it. My best proof for this came from a talk I had with my dad. I showed him this song, but he said it wasn't sexist. He said, well, it's clear that women love it. How else could he have 4 different ones? And this is my father, bless you. This is my father who's believing in these songs, who's become desensitized to their violence. Of course, I don't believe my dad is about to go out there and commit femicide. Listening to sexist music does not make everyone a sexual assaulter. And this is exactly what Dr. Bushman and Anderson concluded in their study. They concluded that media violence is a causal risk for aggression, but a violent song won't make an average child become a murderer. Other risk factors have to be present. I was relieved until I learned what some of these factors were. A common one is a diminished sense of consequence, feeling like your actions won't be harshly persecuted. Or being in an environment that somehow endorses your attitudes and behaviors, like in Mexico, where sexism is prevalent everywhere. But the most important risk factor for violence is the presence of violence itself, whether other people are doing it too. These lyrics are more dangerous in Mexico because the country is already ridden with sexist ideology. It is easier to propagate and create culture when the culture is already receptive to your message. Now, when it comes to media, I realize there's often a chicken or egg sort of problem. Is music a reflection or a catalyst for machismo culture and violence against women? With my research, I do not mean to give a definite answer to the question, but what I do mean to point out is that my presentation is nearing its end, which means that 2 more women will have been raped in Mexico. And by the end of the day, millions of Mexicans will have streamed these songs on Spotify. I don't believe that these factors are disconnected. I don't believe that it's just music. These crosses all represent the person. There are 2,735 of them, 1 for each woman killed in 2016. I'm not saying that they were killed by a song, but we need to acknowledge the powerful influence of words and be conscientious about our listening. As consumers, we have the power to promote change, and until we exercise this power, until we demand better media, until we press pause, there will be thousands of more stories like Lorena's and Fatima's. Thank you.